This is Max from UNFTR for the MeidasTouch Network, and today we're talking about ghosts. Ghosts, dollars, crypto, and crude, all to explain what is going on with Venezuela. See, the Trump administration is advancing dangerous plans to potentially launch a military operation. We've gotten more strikes on vessels purportedly carrying drugs and an aircraft carrier being mobilized to the region. So we're going to unpack all of it and understand what is behind this obsession with Venezuela and how it exposes Trump's economic desperation. Let's go. Dutch disease, Washington consensus, Bolivarian revolution, special period, proven reserves, dollar debasement. Disparate terms and concepts that, when combined, help explain what's behind this.
On Sunday, the U.S. docked a warship in Trinidad and Tobago. The Pentagon's also deployed the world's largest aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, which can hold at least 90 airplanes and attack helicopters, with Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro accusing the Trump administration of fabricating a new eternal war.
The Trump administration is manufacturing a crisis with Venezuela. They're blowing up vessels in the Caribbean under the premise that they're drug boats, without providing any hard evidence. Just trust us, they say. They're narco-traffickers, they say. Now, never mind that a tiny fraction of drugs entering the United States actually originate in Venezuela. If this were really about narcotics, we'd be invading half of the planet, including significant portions of our own country. Oh, scratch that. He's doing that. Okay. Moving on. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and other administration officials are now accusing Nicolas Maduro of running a narco-terrorism regime. It's the same playbook that we've seen before. Make bold accusations, create a threat narrative, ratchet up the tension, and then prepare the American public for military intervention. Pete Hegseth, Trump's defense secretary, who called his own generals lazy and fat, just ordered an aircraft carrier to Trinidad and Tobago. An aircraft carrier to the Caribbean, to threaten a country with a population smaller than California. And get this, he sent it right into a hurricane because, of course he did. This isn't about drugs or terrorism. This is about positioning for a full-scale military operation. The Trump administration is testing the waters, seeing how far they can push this narrative before launching what could be a catastrophic intervention. And with all of the bad actors out there, all of the actual narco regimes in the world, of all the autocrats in all the world, why Venezuela and why now? To understand what's happening right now, it helps to have a little historical context to see how we've always viewed Latin America and the Caribbean. It's not a partnership of equals. It's never been. It's what economist John Williamson calls the Washington consensus, basically a paternalistic neo-colonial framework that treats the entire region as America's economic laboratory and resource extraction zone. And the Washington consensus is essentially a set of policies. It's not a policy prescription per se, but just an observation of our policies toward the region for decades. Privatize everything, open your markets to American capital, cut social spending, deregulate, and above all, let U.S. corporations have access to your natural resources. It's neoliberalism at its peak, and it's been devastating for millions of people across the region. But this mindset didn't start with Williamson's observations. It goes all the way back to the Monroe Doctrine in the 1800s, which essentially declared the entire Western Hemisphere off limits to European colonization, and it positioned us as the dominant power in the region. And the message was clear. This is our hemisphere, stay out. There's even a Venezuela-specific angle to all of this from the early 20th century. See, in the early 1900s, there was a standoff between Venezuela and British creditors. Venezuela had defaulted on its debts, and Britain was considering a military action to collect it. But President Theodore Roosevelt saw this as European interference into the Americas, which would be an affront of the Monroe Doctrine, and he used it as justification for what became known as the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, essentially saying, don't worry about anything happening in this hemisphere. Originally it was just about colonization. In this case, it was about if anyone steps out of line, we'll do the disciplining ourselves. So our interventionist attitude toward Venezuela and toward the whole of the LAC region isn't new. We've treated the entire region as a source of raw materials and labor, installing friendly dictators when democratically elected leaders threatened American corporate interests, crushing any movement that smacked of economic self-determination. Guatemala in 1954, when we overthrew a democratically elected government because it threatened the United Fruit Company's interests. Chile in 1973, the original 9/11, when we overthrew Salvador Allende's regime. Nicaragua throughout the 1980s. The list goes on and on. Venezuela is just the latest chapter in a long story of bloody U.S. imperialism. Okay, so let's talk about Venezuela specifically, and we'll get out of the turn of the last century to bring it to the turn of this century. Because in the United States, we're fed a pretty steady diet of total cataclysm, right? Like the economy of Venezuela is in complete disrepair. That's what led to the migrant crisis. Also, the authoritarian regime of Nicolas Maduro. Dissidents are jailed. There's no democratically elected officials there. It is a complete autocracy, and it's a narco-terrorism state. How much of this is true? How much of it is just propaganda? What's really going on? And to understand the Maduro regime, though, we got to go back to talk about Hugo Chavez. See, under Chavez, Venezuela experienced both tremendous social progress and catastrophic economic mismanagement. It's a complicated story that doesn't fit neatly into either the American narrative of the socialist hellscape or the leftist narrative of revolutionary paradise. See, when Chavez came to power in 1999, he did inherit a deeply unequal country where wealth had enriched a small elite while the majority lived in poverty. And to his credit, Chavez did something about it. He used oil revenues to fund massive social programs, the infamous misiones that provided healthcare, education, housing, and food subsidies literally to millions of Venezuelans. And it worked. Poverty in Venezuela was cut by more than a third during the Chavez years. Extreme poverty fell by 57%. The UN's Food and Agriculture Organization recognized Venezuela for cutting malnutrition in half. UNESCO declared Venezuela illiteracy-free in 2005. UNICEF reported that school attendance increased by 24% in just a decade. Inflation had been running rampant, but finally came under control during the Chavez years. The number of Venezuelans who could finally retire with savings through state-sponsored pensions soared during this period as well. These were very real achievements that improved the lives of millions of people, but the United States just couldn't bring itself to laud these achievements because they were socialist victories, and we just can't have that. It also didn't help that Chavez hosted his own national televised show where he routinely made fun of the United States, but mostly George Bush, nicknaming him burro, or donkey. Now, crucially, one of the things that Chavez failed to do was diversify the Venezuelan economy. See, Venezuela suffers from what economists call the Dutch disease, or the resource curse. So when a country is overly dependent on a single natural resource, in this case oil, it becomes vulnerable to price shocks and price fluctuations, and it fails to develop other sectors of the economy. So some of those oil revenues could have been used to invest in agriculture or manufacturing or technology. Instead, it all went to social spending and, increasingly, a lot of corruption. Now, the other major failure was in how it managed the oil industry itself. So there was a crippling strike in 2003, and after that, Chavez completely nationalized the PDVSA, which is the state oil company, and it purged it of technical experts and replaced them with loyalists instead. Now, the nationalization required foreign companies to accept minority stakes, but only Chevron agreed. So that's how they can still pump oil to this day. But giants like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips have refused to do it, and they've been pursuing lawsuits ever since. Now, to demonstrate the level of our hypocrisy, the United States has been sanctioning Venezuela for a long time, and it refuses to recognize Chavez's successor, Nicolas Maduro. We will happily recognize and do business with autocratic and communist regimes all over the world. We're best buddies with Saudi Arabia. It's an absolute monarchy and a brutal one. We've normalized relations with Vietnam, a one-party communist state. We work with authoritarian regimes in the Middle East and Africa and Asia. And despite all of our anti-China rhetoric, we're tied at the hip with the Chinese communist economy. But Venezuela, for some reason, it's a bridge too far. The political rationale is that Venezuela's sin wasn't authoritarianism, wasn't even communism. It was economic self-determination. It was using its oil wealth to benefit its own people instead of foreign corporations. How could they? It was refusing to play by the rules of the Washington Consensus. That's what American administrations, Democratic and Republican, have always looked upon unfavorably. It's not the authoritarianism, it's the socialism. The idea that a country's resources should benefit its own citizens rather than American shareholders. Now, to be clear, under Maduro, the situation has deteriorated significantly. He is no Hugo Chavez. He does jail dissidents. He rigs elections, rules with an iron fist, allows Colombian mercenaries to operate in the region. Mismanagement, corruption, falling oil prices, and crippling U.S. sanctions have also helped create a genuine humanitarian crisis. But again, let's be clear about the cause and effect here. The economic collapse isn't just because of Maduro's incompetence. It's a factor, but it's not solely that. It's also because of deliberate U.S. policy to strangle the Venezuelan economy and create the conditions for regime change. I mean, Maduro's even said in recent months that he is completely open to doing business with the United States and to normalizing relations. But this can't happen for more than just political and ideological reasons. And this is where our story becomes a ghost story. To really grasp our obsession with Venezuela, we have to talk about Cuba. These two countries have become inexorably linked through what they call the Bolivarian Revolution, a shared ideological project that has kept both governments afloat through mutual support. So let's go back to the 1990s. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Cuba lost its primary economic benefactor, and the result was catastrophic. So Cuba entered what Fidel Castro called their special period. It was a decade of food shortages, fuel shortages, economic contraction, genuine hardship for the Cuban people. And the U.S., seeing yet again an opportunity, doubled down with the Helms-Burton Act in 1996, tightening the embargo and prohibiting foreign companies from doing business with Cuba. We wanted to really put a stranglehold on it because we were finally going to get rid of Fidel Castro. After decades of assassination attempts, decades of fomenting revolution unsuccessfully, the American foreign policy establishment thought that this was it. The Cuban Revolution was finally coming to an end. And then Hugo Chavez won the Venezuelan presidency in 1998, and everything changed. Chavez and Castro formed an immediate bond. They shared similar ideologies, similar enemies, similar visions for their countries. For Castro, Chavez appeared as one of the last champions of Cuban-inspired revolutionary movements in Latin America. For Chavez, Castro was a mentor, a symbol of resistance to American imperialism, and a model for how to maintain political power in the face of U.S. hostility. But their relationship wasn't just ideological, it was deeply practical. See, Venezuela needed expertise in things like healthcare and education and security, and Cuba needed oil and cash. So they made a deal. Venezuela would provide Cuba with heavily subsidized oil, at its peak 105,000 barrels a day, and in exchange, Cuba would send doctors, teachers, intelligence officers, and military advisors to Venezuela. This exchange saved Cuba's economy. Venezuelan oil pulled Cuba out of the special period and gave the Communist Party a lifeline that it desperately needed. And in return, Cuban experts helped Chavez build his social missions, improve healthcare access, and critically, secure his government against internal threats. So between 2000 and 2018, over 219,000 Cuban professionals served in Venezuela. But there was a dark side to the alliance as well. Cuban intelligence officers filled key roles in Venezuela's security apparatus and helped establish the Directorate General of Military Counterintelligence, which monitors military loyalty and has prevented potential coups. So Cuban advisors helped Chavez, and later Maduro, suppress dissent and maintain control. This is why the Cuba-Venezuela relationship matters so much to U.S. foreign policy. For decades, the U.S. has wanted to topple the Cuban government and undo the Castro revolution, even after the passing of Fidel and after Raul Castro stepped down. And we've tried everything. Invasion, Assassination, embargo, isolation, nothing worked. But if we can topple Venezuela, we can cut off Cuba's final economic lifeline. If we can starve the Cuban economy of that vital oil resource that it needs to survive, then we can get 2 regime changes for the price of 1. And that brings us to little Marco. Marco Rubio, Trump's Secretary of State, a central figure in this drama. Rubio is Cuban American. His parents came to the U.S. from Cuba, and like many Cuban Americans, especially in Florida, he carries deep resentment and hostility toward the Castro regime. This isn't just political for him. It's personal. It's generational. It's about the home that his family left behind, the system that they blame for forcing them to leave, and the promise that one day the revolution would finally be undone. I mean, Rubio's been one of the most vocal advocates for harsh sanctions against Venezuela for that very reason. Here's a clip of him from 10 years ago.
With these sanctions, we can end the days of Venezuelan regime officials and thugs repressing innocent Venezuelans in their day jobs and then coming to Florida to live in the lap of luxury and splurge Venezuela's wealth.
Then there's Maria Corina Machado, the woman who recently won the Nobel Peace Prize for her activism against Maduro. Here's the thing. It's a sham. And we know it's a sham because Machado herself said that Donald Trump should have won it. And that tells you everything that you need to know about the political nature of this award. I mean, after all, Kissinger won it, right? So one of the key proponents of Machado receiving the Nobel Prize was none other than Marco Rubio. Because Machado represents the Venezuela opposition that's aligned with U.S. interests. The opposition that wants to return to the neoliberal policies that enrich the wealthy while leaving the poor in misery. She's not a champion of democracy. She's a champion of the old order that Chavez overthrew. And this gets to the heart of the Cuban-American politics in Florida. Cuban Americans are one of the most reliably Republican voting blocs in the country. Why? Because they don't want to normalize relations with Cuba. They see any softening of U.S. policy toward Cuba as a betrayal of the promise that one day they'll return to Cuba that's free of Castro's legacy. All right, so let's be real. It's not just about ideology and old grudges. There are very concrete there's one concrete economic reason that has nothing to do with communism or socialism or ghosts. It's oil. That's really what this is about, right? Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves of any OPEC nation. Yeah, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Iraq, more than Iran. Venezuela has an estimated 300 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. But oil production has collapsed. See, under Chavez's nationalization policies and Maduro's continuing mismanagement, combined with U.S. sanctions that have prevented investment into oil infrastructure, production has fallen from over 3 million barrels a day to less than 1 million. The facilities are crumbling. The expertise has fled. The investment has dried up. So there's that. So of course, the U.S. companies want back in. They invested billions of dollars into Venezuela. They built facilities. They developed fields. Then they were kicked out. And they want their money back. And they want access to those reserves. With a U.S.-friendly government installed in Caracas, American corporations would be able to return and renegotiate contracts under favorable terms and invest in rebuilding the oil infrastructure and take control of production. They'd also be able to cut off Venezuelan oil to Cuba. And there's another thing. Here's where our recent Meidas discussions on cryptocurrency and the U.S. dollar also come into focus in a really interesting way. Get this. The same week that Trump ordered the aircraft carrier to Trinidad and Tobago to rattle Venezuela's cage, he pardoned Changpeng Zhao, known as CZ, the founder of Binance, the world's largest cryptocurrency exchange. Coincidence? Maybe. You tell me. Here's a twist. Ready? Venezuela has been able to partially evade U.S. sanctions by building out a cryptocurrency infrastructure that uses Binance as its backbone. The Venezuela government now accepts payments for oil in crypto, specifically in stablecoins, cryptocurrencies that are pegged to the U.S. dollar. And this allows Venezuela to conduct international trade without using the traditional banking system that the U.S. controls through sanctions. As the New York Times recently reported, Venezuela has become arguably one of the first nations to effectively manage a giant share of its public finances in crypto. PDVSA, the state oil company, pays contractors in stablecoins. Private companies pay bonuses in stablecoins. Everyday Venezuelans can now trade bolivares for stablecoins on Binance. The government has authorized cryptocurrency exchanges as a way to inject hard currency into the economy while circumventing U.S. sanctions. So this is a direct threat to U.S. financial hegemony. And now that the Trump administration has pardoned CZ, does Binance owe him a favor? I mean, how long before Binance suddenly experiences technical difficulties in Venezuela? How long before the Trump family's extremely close relationship with Binance, who helped them build World Liberty Financial stablecoin infrastructure, is leveraged to shut down Venezuela's crypto operations? The timing's not accidental, in my opinion. The Trump administration is moving on multiple fronts simultaneously: military pressure, sanctions, and now potentially cutting off Venezuela's cryptocurrency lifeline. But there's another layer to this. It's what we've talked about before on Meidas, the dollar debasement trade. Central banks around the world are moving away from purchasing U.S. Treasury bonds. Why? Because Trump's erratic behavior, his tariff wars, his general unreliability. These things have all made U.S. Treasuries less attractive as a safe haven. But here's the problem for the United States. With exploding national debt, the government has to sell more and more treasuries to stay funded. And if central banks aren't buying them, who will? Now, we just did a Meidas expose on how hedge funds registered to the Cayman Islands are coming in to buy U.S. treasuries, which is really, really not great. But let's just put that to the side and talk about petrodollars. See, right now in Venezuela, the U.S. is kind of having its cake and eating it too, because Venezuelan oil payments are being backdoor purchased through stablecoins on Binance, meaning they're using the Tether stablecoin USDT, which is backed by the US dollar. So in a roundabout way, Venezuelan oil is being purchased through petrodollars. But as more OPEC nations, led by the BRICS alliance, another story that we did on Meidas, move to develop their own stablecoins that are backed by a basket of commodities and currencies other than the dollar, it means that down the road, Venezuela could theoretically shift purchases away from dollar-backed stablecoins to another. So taking over Venezuela's massive oil reserves would guarantee that it comes back fully into the petrodollar system. It's a smaller piece of the puzzle, but it's not nothing. All right, so let's put it all together. Why is the Trump administration so obsessed with Venezuela right now? Number one, financial interests. American oil companies want access to the largest proven oil reserves in OPEC. They want to return to Venezuela to rebuild the infrastructure and control production. There are billions of dollars at stake. Number two, trade and currency. Bringing Venezuela oil back into the petrodollar system would create more demand for U.S. dollars and treasuries at a time when the U.S. desperately needs buyers. Number three, ideological opposition. The United States has always opposed socialist governments in Latin America, especially those that use natural resource wealth to fund social programs, because it's embarrassing to us that you can do that. Number four, grudges. Marco Rubio and other Cuban-American politicians see toppling Venezuela as the key to finally bringing down Cuba. It's about settling a 70-year-old score with the Castro Revolution. Number five, paternalistic imperialism. The Washington consensus mentality that treats Latin America as America's backyard, where we have the right to determine who governs and how economies are structured. And lastly, tons of oil. The one thing that I didn't just mention, the drugs, because it's not a thing. A small amount of cocaine comes from Venezuela, but fentanyl manufacturing and finishing is proven to flow from China to Mexico predominantly. This narco-terrorism claim is just the pretext for regime change. It's about putting the Chavez Bolivarian revolution in the rearview mirror. It's about settling the score with Cuba once and for all, about ensuring that U.S. corporations control Venezuelan oil. It's about protecting the dollar's dominance in global trade. You know, of all the interventions and regime changes that we pursued and executed over the years, this might be the thinnest rationale and the most egregious examples if we follow through with it. For the MeidasTouch Network, I'm Max from UNFTR. You can find me on YouTube and connect with me on Blue Sky at UNFTR. Also, make sure to check out our website at unftr.com as well, where you can sign up for our free weekly newsletter, browse our directory of progressive resources, and access original essays and archived content, all for free. Thank you to the Meidas Mighty and to the Mycellus brothers for having me here, and I'll catch you next time.
Love this video? Support independent media and unlock exclusive content, ad-free videos, and custom emojis by becoming a paid member of our YouTube channel today. You can also gift memberships to others. Let's keep growing together.